Welcome to St. James United Methodist Church. We are excited and thrilled to host tonight's event, American Public Square at Jewel event, Gun Laws, Housing, and More, State versus Local Control. My name is Emmanuel Cleaver III, and I am the senior pastor here, where our motto is connecting people with God in practical ways. And one of the ways in which we try to do that is by opening the doors of the church for important community events like this. So, welcome. It is also my pleasure to welcome to the podium founder and CEO of American Public Square, Ambassador Alan Katz.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you, Dr. Cleaver, and for not only your remarks, but also for the availability of this beautiful church for us to have this program in tonight. I'm very happy to see everyone here for our panel, which is entitled Gun Laws, Housing, and More, State versus Local Control. Now, I see many of our members are here in the crowd tonight, and I want to thank you all for being here. And as all of you may know, American Public Square relies on the support of its members to maintain its programming and to have programs like this. How many of you are American Public Square members? Just raise your hand, please. Okay, that's great. And we hope those of you who are not yet members, and I'm telling you members, grab one of those people who didn't raise their hand, take an opportunity to officially join us tonight. You can find membership information in your program. I want to thank our partners and sponsors of tonight's program, the Lawyers Association of Kansas City, Becky and Jim Pruitt, Paul Russell, Marnie and John Sherman, St. James United Methodist Church, KC Common Good, and Z-Trip. And additionally, our appreciation goes out to our presenting sponsors, the Hall Family Foundation, H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, PlexPod, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, and William Jewell College. Also, for those of you who are seeking continuing legal education or CLE credit for attending tonight's event, that would only be for those of you that are lawyers. Be sure to touch base with the Lawyers Association of Kansas City this evening. They will be making 1.5 hours available to you. Now, I want to take this opportunity to introduce to you the newest member of the American Public Square team, Denisha Snell, who is our new program manager. Denisha has been a longtime member of American Public Square, served on the program committee for many years. She's heavily involved in other areas of the community as a member of the board of directors of the Heartland's Men's Chorus, the Friends of Art Council with the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, and she's also active with Jack and Jill of America. Additionally, in the past few weeks, Denisha was appointed to the Kansas City Library Board of Trustees by one of our panelists, Mayor Quentin Lucas. Please join us in welcoming Denisha Snell. Tonight's fact sheet and fact checkers were made possible by the William T. Kemper Foundation. Tom Burns and Chrissy LeBeau will be our fact checkers this evening over there. Raise your hand. Okay. For those of you that are new, the fact checkers are there because if something that any of the panelists say turns out not to be factually correct, they will notify the moderator, who will give the panelist or anyone else an opportunity to correct things so that we are dealing here with facts. Inside and in case you want to participate in this, if you look inside of your booklet, you will find one of these. And basically, if you have a question or a fact check, you write it down, you hold it up like this, and one of our volunteers will come by and collect it. American Public Square's own Allison Kelzer. Where are you, Allison? Over there. She is going to be our roving reporter tonight. As the questions are submitted, she will be either asking you to read the question, or she will be asking the questions of our panelists. Several members of the audience have civility bells. Anybody has a bill? You want to ring the bell if you got one? Okay, that happens. If you hear that, that means something uncivil has occurred and everyone needs to stop talking, and we will move on. And finally, in the interest of keeping our conversation flowing and, of course, civil, we would ask you not to clap during the panel discussion. So if there's something that you agree with, you just go like this. And if you disagree with it, you go like that. And that way the flow of the conversation doesn't get changed. And it's now my privilege to introduce tonight's panel moderator, Professor Alan Rostron of the UMKC Law School. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. We do appreciate you coming to hear about these interesting issues and to participate in the discussion that we'll be having tonight. I'm Alan Roster, and I teach at the UMKC Law School here in Kansas City. I've been there now for almost 17 years. I teach constitutional law, and I teach tort law as well, about accidents and injuries. And these kinds of issues we'll be talking about tonight, about preemption, they come up in both of those areas, as they come up throughout most areas of law. Before I was a law professor, I worked for a gun control organization in Washington, D.C. It was called the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence, and we did a number of things, one of which at that time, there were a lot of lawsuits going on against gun manufacturers around the country. A lot of cities and counties had brought such claims. They were very controversial, very interesting, got a lot of attention for a while, and raised, again, a lot of the issues that we'll be kind of talking about tonight, about how should authority be allocated between the different levels of government that we have. So I think this will be a very interesting discussion. I'll be the moderator tonight for our panel, and the goal is to enable a lot of different points of view to be heard, to have a good, balanced discussion, an interesting discussion, and a lot of back and forth. And to be able to really explore these issues, and hopefully for you as the audience to find it informative and interesting and get a clearer sense of what you think about these issues or other aspects of it that you'd like to know more about in the future and think more about. So with that, I'll welcome the members of the panel that we have here tonight. To my left, this is Jeff King. He is an attorney. He's with Sage Law. He specializes in appellate law, trust litigation, and complex financial litigation. He also uses his background as a former Kansas legislator and vice president of the Kansas Senate to help clients with education law, government relations, and public policy consulting. To his left is Janae Hanslick. She is a commissioner of the Johnson County Board of Commissioners. She was elected in 2019, representing the 4th District. Janae is the former CEO of Safe Home, which was a leader in implementing the Johnson County Lethality Assessment Program, which was a collaboration between the District Attorney's Office, law enforcement, and Safe Home, and it significantly reduced domestic homicides in Johnson County. To her left, we have Allison Anderman, I think, who has come the furthest to be here on the panel. She is a senior counsel with the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. She focuses on helping cities and counties around the country to enact effective local gun safety laws and pass extreme risk protection order legislation. And then at the far end of the panel, last but certainly not least, is the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, Quentin Lucas. Mayor Q was sworn in as the 55th mayor of Kansas City back on August 1st, 2019. As mayor, he has prioritized making Kansas City's neighborhoods safer, creating more accessible and affordable housing and public transportation, fostering a healthier community, and improving basic services. He has created and chairs the city's special committee on housing policy. So, again, we won't be applauding all throughout the program, but at least for the start, let's have a round of applause for these great panelists. So, where to begin with this complicated subject? We'll start with Allison, and just with a very basic introduction to what is preemption. What is this basic term before we'll talk about it all night here, but essentially what do we mean when we say that there could be something that was preempted?
So, is this on? Okay. Preemption refers to when a higher level of government takes regulatory authority away from a lower level of government. So obviously federal law can preempt state or local law, and state law can preempt local law. And preemption can be very specific. So a law may preempt a lower level of government from regulating a very specific area, or it can be quite broad because the higher level of government wants to maintain control and uniformity over those policies.
Okay, great. So we'll have that picture in our mind throughout the evening. It's kind of like a hierarchy or a ladder or a pyramid, something vertical in nature where there's the federal and the state or the local. Jeff, you have experience at the state level as a legislator. Now that's the intermediate level of this three-tiered structure. So you could have preemption, I guess, going either way. You might sometimes have the federal government preempting what the state of Kansas could do, but then the state level, you might preempt the local governments. What, as a legislator, how would you make decisions about this? What would guide you in deciding if you should have preemption and do something at the state level or leave it to the local governments?
I think the basic rule in practice is that you complain about preemption when the federal government does it to you, and then you do the exact same thing to local governments. I'm guessing that's not the answer you want, but all too often that probably is the truth. You know, sort of broad principles, and when you're in the trench and in the arena, oftentimes we wouldn't think about this, but I think a lot of times it boiled down to the idea of, if you preempt this, what externalities could come from the local governments taking action on this? You know, are there reasons, are there policy justifications other than just, well, we have the power so we can do it, that you might want to let a local unit of government act differently for one series of individuals than another? And then the idea of what is the traditional realm of power of that unit of government. Just short example, if you talked about mandating fuel efficiency in cars. Well, if a local unit of government did that, it's going to be completely impractical to stop every car that drives through the town. That's not something that can reasonably be done. There's no policy justification for doing it just for individual residents in the town, and that's not something that local unit government normally does to regulate that level of vehicles. So those are the types of things that we would like to think about. All too often at the state level, those thoughts would never come to fruition.
One of the subjects we'll be talking a lot about today is firearm regulation. Some of the people on the panel have specific experience with that or expertise with that. Allison is one of them. Again, she works for an organization that's on that particular issue. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that. Why is it important, in your view, to let local governments regulate firearms as opposed to having it done nationally or by the states? What do you think communities like Missouri can do to the extent, if maybe you can talk a little bit about preemption statutes with respect to firearms and what they allow local governments to do or not do, and what other options local governments have?
Sure, so I have a lot to say about this, so I'm going to try to keep my answers high level, but I'm happy to add any detail on a follow-up. So first, why it's important for local governments to be able to regulate to prevent gun violence. Well, first of all, local governments tend to be more likely to be incubators of novel policies. Practically speaking, it's just easier to get things passed at the local level, and local communities can look at the problems facing them and come up with solutions and get them passed. We've seen this happen a lot in California, where starting in the early 90s, dozens of local gun violence prevention laws were passed, and many of those laws have become state law, and California, as a result, has the strongest gun laws in the country, and it's one of the safest places to live in the U.S. From gun violence. Another reason it's important to let local governments regulate for gun violence prevention is because they understand the needs of their communities often better than state-level regulators do. So, for example, cities like Kansas City and St. Louis are predominantly, the gun violence in the cities is the result of interpersonal violence that disproportionately impacts communities of color, whereas out in rural areas, gun violence is mostly a result of suicide. So allowing local communities to take the steps that are necessary to address that particular type of gun violence is important. There is still a lot that can be done in a state like Missouri, which has what I call very comprehensive preemption. State laws are written differently. Some state laws, even California does preempt some aspects of firearm regulation, but Missouri goes much further than most states. But there's still a lot that can be done, and one thing in particular is, I don't know, do you want me to get into the specifics now, or?
I think that's some of that.
Okay.
Sure.
One thing that's really important is, especially in a place like Kansas City, is to invest in these types of community-led evidence-based public health approaches to treating violence like a preventable disease. These programs have been implemented in cities around the country. You might be familiar with them under the names of Cure Violence or Ceasefire. They're different approaches, but what they have in common is they typically work in these disproportionately impacted communities and try to understand the cycle of violence as retaliatory and preventable. And they have had remarkable results. Cities like Oakland and Richmond in California have seen dramatic reductions in gun homicides in their cities. And we have reports written about this on our website that I would encourage you to look into. And Kansas City does have a program like this in place called Aim for Peace. And I am going to leave it to the mayor to talk a little bit more about that program, but if you want. But I think cities can invest more heavily in those programs and make sure that they're implemented properly. Another really important thing that cities can do is require law enforcement to trace crime guns. So those are guns that are found or recovered by police and trace back the origin of that gun to the manufacturer, distributor, dealer, and first legal purchaser. This not only helps law enforcement solve the specific crime that they're investigating, but it also allows them to look at aggregate data and figure out whether there are manufacturers or dealers that are pumping guns into the community, probably as a result of illegal trafficking. And again, Kansas City is a great example of why this works. The city brought a lawsuit against a manufacturer and several dealers where there was credible evidence that they were engaged in gun trafficking. And again, the mayor can talk a little bit more about that. But so gun tracing is also really important, but local law enforcement agencies often don't trace crime guns because they don't have the resources or the training to do so. So improving investments and training. And then there are a number of ordinances that, in spite of Missouri's preemption statute, can still be enacted. St. Louis has actually enacted something called a lie and try ordinance, which requires a gun dealer to report to law enforcement if a person fails a background check. This allows law enforcement to investigate to see whether the person violated a law when trying to purchase the gun. St. Louis has also enacted a law that requires gun owners to report when any of their firearms are lost or stolen. This allows law enforcement to find a gun before it gets into the wrong hands, but it also prevents a person from illegally selling a gun and then claiming it was lost or stolen when the gun is traced back to them. Very quickly, some major cities have set up gun tip hotlines that allow residents to make anonymous calls to law enforcement to report gun trafficking. And in several cases, when that tip leads to solving a crime, law enforcement will not prosecute a lower level offense, such as illegal gun possession. And finally on my list, law enforcement, cities, localities have a lot of purchasing power when it comes to guns. They buy a lot of guns for their officers and other city employees, and they can ensure that the dealers from whom they're purchasing are following best practices, making sure that those dealers are trained in how to identify illegal sales and prevent them, and secure their inventory so that guns aren't stolen through break-ins, which happens a lot. And law enforcement can also train dealers on how to identify straw purchases, which is when a person buys a gun illegally for someone else, and to prevent other types of illegal sales.
Thank you. Mayor Lucas, I'll turn to you. As Allison was saying, in Missouri does have a statute that preempts local regulation of firearms. And I'm not sure how widely known that is. Over the years, there have been times when community groups that are interested in this issue, I know, have reached out to me and said, oh, we would like to make a push, for example, to ban assault weapons or something like that in Kansas City, and I'd like to talk to you about that. What advice would you have? And I have to say, well, my advice is you cannot do that. That's there's a state law that prevents you from doing that. You've nevertheless found ways to take some steps with respect to the gun issue. You've led for ordinances that limit weapon possession in the city for juveniles and people with domestic violence convictions or who have orders of protection. So can you talk a little bit about that? Where did you come up with that idea, and what is your goals with that?
So first of all, good evening, and thank you all for being here, and thank you, Reverend Cleaver, for having us at St. James United Methodist Church. on our gun ordinances, and I'll try not to get too legal and perhaps dull on it, but we actually read the preemption statute in Missouri closely. And it comes from this background, and I mean all respect to my friends in the state legislature. But every now and then they plan to do something and they mess it up. You may remember a few years ago they had tried to create a ban on cities passing minimum wage laws, but they actually had erred in part of their promulgation of that statute. So the city of St. Louis, for about 2 weeks, had a new minimum wage. Now, of course, the state often figures it out after that. But I liked it to look at the preemption statute in Missouri, and there was this neat exception, which said that to all cities thou shalt not pass any law relating to gun regulation anywhere in Missouri, except where the carrying of guns would be prohibited by federal law. And so we said, oh, how interesting. So then that just leads you to 18 U.S. Code, right? And you're looking at our criminal statutes, and you say, well, where is it unlawful for someone to carry a law or carry a gun under federal law? And then it turns out there are entire classes of persons that can't actually carry firearms under federal law. That includes minors. So they can't possess handguns unless in connection with hunting or their parents had given it to them or something of that sort. And that certainly involves domestic violence offenders, those who have been adjudicated domestic abusers. And by the way, one thing I learned as I was dealing with these is sometimes when we actually use the clinical or legal terms for these folks, people miss it. So I've actually had to say in more situations, wife beaters. Right? Because if you say domestic abusers, people start to think that that's just some legal construct. No, instead I want to say terrible people who are huge threats to their families shouldn't have guns to create further threats to their families. And you asked about opposition and reception. Largely, when we had first introduced the ordinance relating to juveniles, which was the first of them, most people said, oh, that makes sense. Perhaps a 15-year-old who had not been given a firearm by their parent shouldn't actually just be walking the streets without them. There was some concern about whether we were looking to arrest young people. I think we were able to cure that in the ordinance itself, creating something that's more like diversion. The analogy is, if any of you have minors who have ever been arrested for minor in possession of alcohol, if your 18-year-old is caught with Coors Light, usually there's a process that doesn't typically involve some sustained incarceration, but instead counseling and other things to encourage them not to continue to do that, at least as minors. So we thought maybe with guns, we could do the same thing. So that passed successfully, and then I will admit the Juvenile Gun Ordinance was my idea. Domestic violence offenders was not. It actually related to a visit that I had taken to a domestic violence shelter. There was a lawyer there on my visit, and there was a mother of a woman who had been killed by her husband and who had abused her for a number of years. And they said, we think that you can have an ordinance that does this. And they'd been trying it for years at the state legislative level, and trying, and they said, is there something you can do? We looked it up, and we saw that we could. So what I've taken from these is largely that it takes an amazing amount of creativity, some amount of ingenuity. I myself am a lawyer, but I've surrounded myself by much smarter lawyers, like Allison. And that's the sort of thing that we've at least tried to do in Kansas City, because I will give a view that I don't think is controversial. But A, there are too many guns on the streets of Kansas City. That's true. Although the fact checkers may say, hey, a lot of people disagree, like a majority of Missouri. But I think there are too many guns in Kansas City, and there are too many guns in the hands of people who should not have them. And that whole group of should not have them, I like starting with folks who are certifiably a threat, which is domestic offenders, domestic violence offenders in a lot of cases.
So to follow up a little bit, you've addressed the issue of juveniles and domestic violence offenders, and I gather it's not preempted by the state because they're already prohibited, so you're adding another layer of enforcement to a prohibition that already exists. Are there other aspects of it that you'd like to see addressed in the future? Is there other local legislation on the way that you'd like to have?
Short answer is yes. If you were to go through federal code, there are other classes of persons that we could add that extra layer of enforcement. And by the way, there were some who asked, well, isn't this just creating a redundancy, right? If a 15-year-old already cannot carry a firearm, then why are you creating that level of enforcement, that extra layer? And the answer is very simply this. Actually, in some ways, for better, a United States Attorney's Office will rarely actually prosecute a 16-year-old for a misdemeanor possession offense. And that's a good thing, by the way. We don't want them necessarily in that business. However, what we do want to be able to do is ensure that officers can both seize the firearm and that we get to provide that level of counseling service, really the opportunities to tell young people not to possess. So that's why we're there. In terms of other areas of legislation, I've done my trips to Jefferson City, which is a fascinating place. And we continue, I think, to say we have several good ideas for common sense, and we call it really just gun reform. Again, not taking guns from any lawful owners or anything of that sort, but some of those have included certain red flag laws, certainly other efforts that are trying to say if there is a person who is presenting some level of threat to themselves or to the community, that perhaps they should not be entitled to possess a firearm. Those have often been received either by deaf ears or listening ears when we're there, that then turn to something different thereafter. But I'll just end with this vignette. I was invited to the Governor of Missouri State of the State speech this year. And it was a fine speech, and it's a great time in Missouri. But what I saw from that, he had this line that said, and let's be clear, I have always stood up for the Second Amendment. And then there was a big standing ovation. And I kind of wanted to say, I always have too. I just believe that like any of our rights, like some rights to do any number of things, right, when you commit certain crimes that eliminate your ability to do things like walk freely in society, then perhaps you also shouldn't be able to carry your firearm. That's an ongoing debate in Missouri, 200 years into our great state experiment, but we'll keep fighting.
Thank you. These issues are interesting. I mean, I liked what you said, and it's interesting how, you can spin a lot of these things either way. You could say, well, if the federal government's already doing something on an issue or the state government's already doing something, why do we need the local government to do it as well? But you could also say, well, then what's the harm? Why not have each level of government approaching the issue in its way and doing what it thinks would be most effective or what it's best suited to do? Janae, let me ask you, you have experience as a legislator at the local government level, at the county commission level, and in particular in Kansas. Now, Kansas, people may, if they live in Kansas or if they follow the stories in the newspaper, they've had a fair amount of legislation about guns over the years, and in particular at colleges, about the relating guns at colleges and university campuses. So could you talk about that and what impact you think it's had, positive or negative?
Sure. Well, thank you. And thank you for having me here tonight. I really appreciate it. And I do have to say, I'm not an attorney, but I am a social worker. And in fact, 2 years ago, I retired as the director of Johnson County's Domestic Violence Agency. So I do appreciate all of Kansas City's efforts to protect victims of domestic violence. It's certainly something I saw every day in the terror that people feel when they are threatened by guns. In fact, there have been studies done that show that people who have shot their partners with a gun have been asked, if a gun was not available, would you have killed that person? And almost to a person, they say, no, I would not. It was just too easy, and I probably wouldn't have done it. So with that said, now that I am on the Board of County Commissioners in Johnson County, I am dealing with preemption issues every single day. And, Thomas Jefferson said that the government closest to the people serves the people best. And I'm beginning to believe that more and more as I see the impact of state legislation on our local communities. And certainly gun laws, common sense gun laws are something that I believe we really need more control of at the local level. For example, in July of 2017, the Kansas State Legislature passed laws allowing people 21 years and older to have concealed carry in public buildings, including college campuses. And that has caused a lot of concern, for example, at Johnson County Community College, because students as well as staff wondered, what can this mean for our community? We really would rather not have this, but they had no choice. The other part of that law was that the schools could prohibit concealed carry if they provided security equipment like metal detectors or wands. And unfortunately, though, the cost is so prohibitive that really isn't an option. In fact, we've dealt with that at the county level when we're looking at our own many county buildings. Do we want to provide security so that people cannot take firearms into those buildings? And especially, I was talking to Jeff a little earlier, with the property tax lid we have in Kansas, we really can't afford to do that in our buildings. So it's very frustrating when the state takes away the ability for us to make those decisions locally, where we want to put our money, how we want to maintain safety in our public buildings.
Great, thank you. Jeff, you talked earlier a little bit about preemption generally. We've kind of been talking a little bit specifically about the gun issue. Do you have thoughts about that? I mean, do you think there are situations where it really does make sense to have state-level preemption for that particular issue?
I think there are, and certainly, I want to be clear on the difference between the concepts of, preemption and actual policy at the state level. I think the mayor brought up a very good point. One of the most important functions of any local government is the ability to enforce public safety and to protect the citizens that the local government serves. Federal law enforcement, state law enforcement don't have the ability to do that on the community level nearly as much as your local police force does, nor can they do it as effectively. The mayor's right. We don't want U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuting 15-year-olds for gun possession. That doesn't make sense. And so when we deal with the thought of preemption at the state level, that doesn't mean preemption of enforcement laws in most instances. So I applaud the mayor for his efforts to take what, having been there in the Kansas side, and Mr. Mayor, all of your problems would be solved if it were Topeka making your laws instead of Jefferson City. So I'm sorry about that for your sake. And I hear a couple of responses to that I understand well. But the idea that when you have these loopholes in the law, some of which I think are actually intentional and should be intentional, we need at the state level when we design preemption to understand that local enforcement, even when they're not doing policy making on the law itself, is vital to making sure that the laws we have actually reflect the needs of the community and reflect restoration of the community rather than just be punitive in nature. When it comes to broader issues, my Senate district when I served in the Senate was the ruralest part of the state, the poorest part of the state, with small towns miles and miles and miles from others. Coming here to Johnson County, I can walk from a friend's house half a mile away and be in 4 different towns and not even know when I'm crossing boundaries. When we at the state legislative level looked at concealed carry laws and the preemption of local ordinances on concealed carry, one of the things that my Johnson County colleagues were gravely concerned about was apply that test I talked about before. What are the externalities, the unintended consequences of allowing each individual local government to legislate concealed carry laws? Well, on that walk I took, I might have violated multiple laws in different places and not even known about it. So I do think in those types of areas, state preemption, be it in the gun control area and other areas, is very important, even if from a policy perspective it goes against what you might believe.
Allison, let me follow up on that and I'll maybe play devil's advocate a little bit. I mean, you work for an organization that would like to have stronger gun laws passed. Someone might say, well, I'm sure you would take them at whatever level of government you could get. I mean, if you felt like you could get it passed at a local level, you'll advocate for that. If the state legislature was on your side, you'd welcome that. If it was Congress who was open to passing something, then you'd be happy to take it at that level. And I think there's some truth in that for everybody on all sides of different policy issues. But sort of setting that aside about the political feasibility of it, in an ideal world, if you could shape sort of gun policy, what level of government do you think it would make sense for it to be at? I mean, are there some issues that you think would be best handled at the state level, for example?
Yeah, and I mean, I take your point, but there are definitely certain types of policies that would not work from a practical perspective at the local level. So we wouldn't advocate for certain types of laws at the local level. Definitely strong federal laws is what we need to meaningfully reduce the epidemic of gun violence in the United States. Missouri in particular is a real victim of that. It has one of the highest gun death rates in the country, and between 2017 and 2018, the gun death rate for individuals under the age of 18 increased nearly 20%. That's, I'm sure that will be fact-checked, but that's based on the most recent Whiskers numbers. So states, just like you were talking about in terms of these kind of potential problems with patchwork systems of laws, we have a patchwork system of state gun laws where we have states with very strong laws like Illinois, bordering states with very weak laws like Indiana, and guns flow, we know from the data, from Indiana into Illinois at a higher rate than they flow from Illinois to Indiana. It's called the crime gun export rate. And those are guns used in crimes. So what we need to prevent those problems and to have everyone protected by the same strong laws that in California, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey result in very low gun death rates, we need to have laws at the federal level, really.
Mayor Lucas, let me ask you about, I think one of the realities underlying this, in some ways this debate about which government should be regulating things wouldn't matter so much if political power was distributed equally throughout the country at all different levels. In other words, like when I worked on the gun control issue and we were filing lawsuits, we knew the reality facing us. There were some large cities, for example, where we would have a lot of support. And the mayor and the city officials in Atlanta, for example, would want to file a lawsuit against the gun industry. In the state of Georgia as a whole, the state legislature, we did not have support. Or New Orleans was one of the first cities to file a lawsuit against the gun industry. But the Louisiana legislature as a whole is much more not on our side of that issue, much more supportive of gun rights. And that's true in Missouri as well. Everybody, I think, realizes that the political balance is different in the large cities on the edge of the state. Kansas City and St. Louis are more Democratic, more liberal. The rest of the state is more conservative and more Republican. What about that? I mean, would that be a solution to this, perhaps? I mean, one way, perhaps, is maybe you could have, try to achieve the best of both. Have preemption to a large extent for the rest of the state, but maybe carve out exceptions for Kansas City and St. Louis. Do you think that's feasible or beneficial?
It would be very feasible, very beneficial. It is exceedingly unlikely. And I actually had recent experience with this. You might have caught in the press, myself, the mayor of St. Louis, the mayor of Springfield, and Columbia have been meeting perhaps monthly since I became mayor of Kansas City. And we all came to a meeting one day in Columbia with our proposals on how we can address violent crime. And God bless my friends in St. Louis, because their first item was, well, we're going to propose to the state legislature that they carve us out. And Columbia and Springfield, they looked at me as if to deliver the practical political news, which is that the preemption on gun legislation was passed precisely to keep us from acting, for the very basis of the point you just made, which is that in almost no other Missouri cities are they actually looking to pass this type of legislation. So the intent was to keep our cities from acting for whatever number of reasons you may think. I tend to sometimes think it relates to control, particularly control of urban minority populations. I don't think it's just as simple as liking guns, but maybe that's a chat for another day. And so it is my view that to the extent we come up with solutions, we often have to work around it. But, I will note this, and I appreciate Allison for making the point. When you look at actually preventable deaths relating to guns, homicides, suicides, accidental deaths, it is a significant killer of young people in Missouri towns and cities. It is not just a Kansas City issue. It's a suburban issue. It's a rural issue. And I would hope sometimes that we have more realistic chats about that. When I think about getting guns out of the hands of a minor who doesn't have permission from parents to have it, and it's unrelated to a hunting use, I'm thinking about saving a minor's life, whether it be a child on the streets of Kansas City or a kid in Cape Girardeau. Right? There is just a significant challenge, I think, around the state in addressing that issue long term.
I'm going to pause for a moment and go to our roving reporter, Allison Kelzer. She's roving, I think, back here. Allison?
Hi, Alan. Great conversation so far. We do have a number of questions from the audience. First, I'd like to direct this question to Commissioner Hanslick. As we know, at the state, local, federal level, the legislative process can be lengthy at times. In the meantime, there are people still being afflicted by this violence. What else is being done to save lives?
I assume that the question refers to gun violence, and that's a very difficult question because in Johnson County, because we are an urban area, just as in the case with Kansas City, Missouri, we have different needs and a different culture. And I think, referring to what the mayor had said, to try and have consistent laws across the state means that some areas have less control just by the nature of their culture and their needs. It's interesting to me, thinking about the whole issue of preemption. Oftentimes, laws that are preemptive are not necessarily passed because everyone agrees this is a great idea. Oftentimes, they are because it's a one issue, it's a special interest group, or it may be a political reason, or it may be because it's an attempt to address a problem in one area and there are unintended consequences of that. So for example, with gun laws, the law to allow concealed carry everywhere in public buildings has a different implication for Dodge City, Kansas than it does for Overland Park, Kansas. And I think in Kansas we struggle with those same issues as in Missouri, maybe not quite to the same extent, but we have gun violence in Johnson County, and it's a very challenging issue to talk to our state legislature when there are those different perspectives coming from different parts of the state.
Allison?
Yeah, Alan, I have another one here. Under Missouri Revised Statutes 571.030, it is classified as unlawful use of weapons. What do we do when the police are lax to criminals but harsh to those who use firearms lawfully?
Fascinating question. So our premise is that police are lax to criminals and harsh to those who are lawfully using weapons. I'll use one of those lawyer tricks and just say I may disagree with your premise. There are lots of ways that we can check the activity of police. I guess the question I would ask to said question is, was the person who is subject to police harassment while lawfully exercising their right to carry firearms, were they subject to any criminal charge? In which case, then, were they entitled to due process, et cetera? I mean, to the extent that they were, then I'm not sure there was a significant problem. But maybe I'll just go from this. I have heard very few situations, of at least the Kansas City Police Department, where someone is lawfully exercising their right to carry firearms, it was their own firearm and they owned it, etc., and then subsequently have brought some claim against the police for any type of incident. There are avenues to do that, just like someone can bring a claim for police brutality or anything of that sort. There's an Office of Civilian Complaints. By and large, that office is not populated by complaints from lawful gun owners about their exercise of their right to carry firearms and being subjected to police harassment thereafter.
Ready for another question, Alan?
Sure.
At the core of this issue, is this issue a rural or urban issue?
And do you mean the issue firearms or preemption or?
I believe so. I think that in this question, they're asking specifically about firearms.
Nationally, 2/3 of gun deaths annually, approximately 2/3, are gun suicide. And the gun suicides are committed, I know that's controversial to say that, mainly by white men using their own guns. I don't have the data in front of me, but my guess is most of those people are located in rural issues. And that, granted, there is a lot of gun violence in certain concentrated urban areas, but again, most of the gun deaths in the United States are suicide, and suicide by gun is absolutely preventable and correlated with access to guns.
I really wish when I served in the state senate we had fact checkers and civility bells, because I think it would have dramatically changed the answers to most questions like these. So I most certainly am not going to try to speak from facts I don't know. I'm going to speak from the experiences I know. I grew up in a town of 9,000 people. When I served in the state senate, my hometown of 9,000 people is the largest community I represented. And in that town of 9,000 people, when I was 16, I had a handgun pulled on me and shoved in my face. I lost a cousin to gun violence in his own home by a stranger with a handgun in a town of 11,000 people. My district per capita had one of the highest murder rates in the state and had one of the highest incidents of gun-related crimes in the state. Do I think that this issue is an urban issue, sometimes more than a rural issue, as far as gun-related violence on individuals other than oneself? Yes, I do. But I think often lost in this debate is the component of rural poverty, of rural desperation, of rural drug use, and really of the decline that we see in rural America. So while I truly do applaud the mayor's efforts and regret that the home rule statute or constitutional provision we have in Kansas wouldn't even let the Kansas legislature exempt communities like Kansas City to try their own unique instances. I don't want lost in this discussion the impact that gun violence has on rural America, and think they need to be as much a part of the solution as urban America.
We have another question here from the audience. We're going to kind of switch topics here. As we know, healthcare can be an issue in rural America, just as access to firearms is. What is the discussion around mental health screenings and gun access? Do you see a correlation between domestic violence and mental health? There's also a follow-up question here about what's being done for people with PTSD.
Well, I can speak to the issue of domestic violence and mental health. First of all, people with mental illness are not necessarily any more violent than anyone else in the community. What we do know about people who abuse their partners is that usually it's a result of their own experience of violence in childhood. That's really the root of it. So for me, I guess I object to connecting domestic abuse with mental health, because there's an implication that someone who has a mental illness is violent, and that is not the case. In terms of guns and domestic violence, I really believe that it's really important that we enforce those federal laws, and I applaud Missouri and I applaud Mayor Lucas for doing that, because it is very frustrating when someone has been convicted of a misdemeanor or worse, and they still have access to guns. And then we wonder why people don't leave abusive relationships when the abuser has threatened to use a gun and the victim knows there's nothing that they can do about it, that person can continue to threaten them. So it's a huge issue, and it's one that certainly we all continue to struggle with.
We're going to switch topics here to talk about affordable housing. The lack of affordable housing is a serious crisis impacting large cities across the country. How can the federal government successfully change the strict zoning and regulatory laws that often continue to inflate housing prices? When it comes to these local zoning laws, how does preemption between the federal and local government come into play?
I'll start with that, although there is a lot there. Let's first start with, so what can the federal government do? A lot of it actually will relate to how we create and support lending policy. I think in the creation of or support for multifamily housing development, mixed income development, support for a number of federal programs like the Community Development Block Grant, which on average support from the federal government has stagnated for a number of decades. And we're talking about programs that were vital priorities of government during the Carter administration. And we've largely seen, if not decline, certainly not increase at a level that keeps up with inflation since that time. So I think there's much that we can do. When I started service as mayor of Kansas City, not mayor, as city councilman some years ago, we had a larger community development block grant budget than we do today, although our needs for creation of affordable housing, social services certainly have not declined. So that's one key area. But there's one thing that we note there that's very interesting in that question, which is, what does zoning policy have to actually do with the creation of affordable housing and affordable neighborhoods? And the answer is lots, just tons. I got to see this in a special way some years ago. I went to the American Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham. And if you looked at zoning maps, when they were basically just segregating communities by race, it is shockingly similar to zoning maps even in this city of where you have single-family housing development versus where you have more flexible zoning. And so a breakup and a reimagining of what zoning should be, I think, is vital for us, including things as simple as what is a good lot size, right? How many persons can live in a lot, right? What type of density will we support? Do we want to allow certain commercial uses so that we're not just building shopping centers out somewhere far, but instead creating better walkability in our neighborhoods? I think this is one place I won't blame state or federal government. This is a fundamentally local question. And the thing is, us, the local people, we have a lot of NIMBYism within us. And so we really don't like uses that we don't want, or sometimes that challenge our view of what our neighborhood should be. We don't like those next to us. There are lots of conversations sometimes about, do you want to permit a group home in your area? Do you want to permit a halfway house in your neighborhood? And a lot of neighborhoods, I might even say most, even in our city, would say no if they're zoned pure single-family developments. So the fault lies in ourselves in that situation.
And just a quick follow-up on the mayor's comments, and I think we agree entirely on this issue. An example of, I think, preemption gone wrong is California a number of years ago actually passed a law at the state level greatly restricting the zoning flexibility that communities had, with the express intent of freeing up the ability for affordable housing in communities where zoning was restricting that. While that is an incredibly laudable goal and one that I praise the California legislature for attempting to solve, the results in practice were not nearly what the legislature actually intended, because as the mayor pointed out, local units of government understand the needs of their communities better than any state, certainly a state that expansive could, and the unintended consequences that result from well-intended but misguided state action can be pretty profound.
Commissioner Hanslick, do you want to say a bit about housing in Kansas?
Yes, this is the issue I get most excited about. Maybe you may have to ring a civility bell on me. In 2016, whoa, talk about preemption. In 2016, the Kansas legislature passed a law that prohibits cities and municipalities and local governments from passing any kind of ordinance that would, and I want to make sure I say it exactly right, it would prohibit local governments from enacting rules to control the rental or purchase price of privately owned residential or commercial property. It's also known as inclusionary zoning. That's when a local government will have planning ordinances that require a share of new construction to include units and to be affordable for low to moderate income people. Now we've talked here about, and I just recently mentioned this, that a lot of times preemptive laws are passed for a specific reason. It's like using a sledgehammer to kill an ant, and it has very negative consequences and unintended consequences across the state. In this case, this law was passed specifically against Lawrence, Kansas, because they had been starting to talk about considering zoning changes that would allow inclusionary zoning. And this was a reaction to that. And what it has meant is, for example, in Johnson County, if Overland Park wants to give a tax incentive to a developer, for example, to for building an apartment house, they are not allowed to do that under state law. They cannot say, okay, Mr. Developer, we're going to give you this much tax incentive, but in return you have to have a certain percentage of your units that are affordable for low to middle income people. They're not allowed to do that. And so it's very, very difficult. I've been asked by many people, why can't the cities just tell the developers they have to include so much affordable housing? I said, because the state legislature says we can't do that. So, as in the case of Lawrence, different cities are looking at workarounds. For example, in Lawrence, they started a housing trust fund, and it is funded through a sales tax. In Johnson County, I've had conversations with some of our city council people about doing a housing trust fund and perhaps requiring the developers who receive tax incentives to put in a certain amount of money toward this fund. So we're looking at ways to work around this law, but it is so frustrating to have our hands tied when we know what we want to do in our community, and we know our community is looking for ways to incentivize affordable housing, and the state has prevented us from doing that.
Can I just say something briefly? Jeff and Janae, if you all ran Kansas, it would just be this utopia. Oh my gosh. Affordable Housing Trust Fund in Johnson County, a Republican state senator, and we're talking about gun reform. I love you guys. So not only do I love you, I want to clone you and bring you over here. But that's all, sorry.
In 10 years of serving in office, you were the first Democrat that ever said that to me. So you've made the rest of my evening for me. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
This might be a good time to check in with our fact checkers, Tom and Chris. If you have something you can tell us, maybe they got something right, maybe they got something wrong, or if you just want to shed light on any other interesting aspects of what we've been hearing about.
Is this on? Hot? Yeah. Let's see. We're stepping back to guns for a second. Sorry for the jump back here. One person said, is it true that city officials can experience criminal penalties for passing something that goes against a state preemption? And it is in some states. In Kentucky, local officials are subject to criminal penalties. In Florida, an official could be removed from office for passing an ordinance. Also, there could be fines and civil liability in Florida. In Texas, there's even, let's see, they would put a limit on free speech when it endorses sanctuary cities. So in this case, and officials can be removed from office if they violate that. And also in Arizona, it's a felony to pass a smart gun law, for example. So I don't think that's the case in Missouri, but there are some very severe penalties for cities if they do pass an ordinance that goes against a state preemption. There was a fact check asking about crime and the 40% jump in crime, gun crime, from 2017 to 2018.
I didn't say 40%.
That's what this says. I don't know.
I said nearly 20%. It's 18% in the Worcester's number.
Okay. And then we were going to look it up, but gun crime is so broad. You have injury, you have death, you have suicide, so it would take a while to compile that. If you want to see us afterwards, we can try to come up with something.
I can point you directly to the source.
Okay.
It's a CDC fatal injury report.
Okay, great.
So we've heard a fair amount about really two of the main issues that were on the agenda for tonight. Certainly firearms, housing is another one that was specifically mentioned. Commissioner Hanzlik, if I could ask you, I mean, the fact sheet mentions all kinds of other issues that this comes up for. I know I've seen stuff in the newspaper recently about like plastic bags in Kansas, but are there other issues in that maybe where Johnson County in particular wants to do something and the rest of Kansas may not allow it?
Sure. No, as I mentioned, since I've taken office as county commissioner, I have seen and experienced more and more frustration because of the broad scope of preemptive statutes that are in Kansas, in the state legislature. And just some of the other issues that we struggle with in Johnson County because of preemption is, of course, the big one is the property tax lid. What that says is that the county cannot raise property taxes above the consumer price index for, there's a certain formula for how the period of time. But what that does, and if you do, you have to have a public vote. So what that means is that, first of all, we have to start our budget process really, really early in the year so that if indeed, when we do come up with our budget for the following year, if it is going to be above that limit, then we have to arrange to put it on the ballot. So we for example, next month we'll be starting our 2021 budget process many months early. And it also prevents us from being able to respond to increases in costs of things that are not reflected in the consumer price index, like the cost of road materials or construction materials or health insurance for employees. Those are not things that are measured in the CPI. So it's not really a fair measurement for us to use because the county has costs that go up every year that we have to pay. We don't have any choice. So with this tax lid, it means we have to make some difficult decisions to stay under that tax lid unless we want to go ahead and take it to a vote. So that's one of the frustrating issues. Also, there's the mortgage registration fee that was taken away by the state a couple years ago. Again, that's one of those things that was a big issue that was pushed by the Kansas Association or Kansas Realtors Association because they said that this fee was preventing people from buying homes. Well, I don't know if you've seen the price of homes in Johnson County these days, but the mortgage registration fee was just a tiny part of that. So what Johnson County had to do in response was raise the mill levy to make up for about $15 million a year in income. You mentioned the plastic bag ban. In Kansas, the Kansas Chamber of Commerce has recently introduced legislation, or they've requested legislation that would prohibit municipalities from passing ordinances that would ban single-use plastic bags. And you wonder, well, how can anyone be against banning plastic bags? Well, they feel that grocers, restaurants, and convenience stores said that they would face a patchwork of regulations throughout the state, and that wouldn't be fair. So that's a big issue. And then finally, a huge issue is Medicaid expansion. Without Medicaid expansion in Kansas, the county has had to cover the cost of uncompensated mental health care to the tune of about $7 million a year. So all told, it's very frustrating when we're going through the budget process and we're looking at costs that we have had to absorb because it's the right thing to do and it's what people in our community want, but we have not had assistance from the state, or the state has put laws into place that make it more difficult for us to provide that quality of service that is expected by our residents.
While we're talking about Kansas, Jeff, do you want to, we talked a little bit about the politics of this. It's certainly like in Missouri that a lot of this is driven by the fact that you've got some heavily Democratic cities and then the rest of the state is more Republican. Is it a political thing in Kansas, or is it just a matter of sort of turf between the state legislators and the local, and is there any way it could be depoliticized?
And I know, and this question's a hard one for me because I know, we've spoken about some incredibly important policy issues, gun violence, gun control. Someone brought up healthcare issues. My hometown was the largest self-standing community in the state to lose its hospital about 5 years ago, and the consequences of that were dramatic. And I don't want to seem heartless or unconcerned about those policy issues because I'm very concerned about them and would love to have a dialogue with folks here about them. But when it comes to preemption, it's really a matter of process and civility more than it is policy. And in my opinion, this is one issue in an area of rapidly diminishing bipartisanism that both Republicans and Democrats have worked in a bipartisan fashion, and that is they have completely abused the doctrine of preemption and let might equals right trump what really preemption should be, and I think in the foundation of our government was, which is the idea of what unit of government can best solve the issue at hand. The federal government does this to the states do it to the local level, and I know in Kansas anyway, there's a tendency to think about it, especially in Johnson County, of a conservative state government with a more liberal local government that's pushing back against that dynamic. In my former Senate district, it was a much more conservative local government pushing back against a less conservative state government. Go to Virginia, and in Virginia, you have now a legislature that has moved much more to the left, and local units of government that are much more to the right. So, and I know the fact checkers will check this on me as well, but I believe close to 90% of the local, I think it's the county governments that have addressed the issue of gun control have actually passed ordinances to prohibit the enforcement of gun control from the state level, from state laws at the local level, the exact flip of the scenario that tends to happen in Kansas. I know it may sound pie in the sky, it may sound almost fanciful in today's political climate, but I think the key to addressing this issue is realizing as much as possible what we've lost from losing civility in our form of government, and we have lost it to such a great extent, is if you want to apply preemption the way it was meant to be applied, Start with a blank slate. Try to think about if the shoe were on the other foot and I'm not in the majority in the state legislature, but I'm in the minority, or if I'm at the local unit of government, not the state level, what would be the best way to address this issue? We see that sorely lacking, and because might tends to make right on this issue, we see preemption applied because people can apply it, not because they should.
As well said. Do you want to add something, Janae?
I just wanted to say I agree with Jeff. I don't see preemption as solely a political issue. It can be, and there are instances where it is, but it is also an area where there are special interest groups. There are, we talked about the rural and urban polarization, and also where there's an attempt to, as I've mentioned a couple times now, address one problem with that big mallet that's overkill on the state legislature's part. But I find, the saying is politics make strange bedfellows. I find myself agreeing with people across the spectrum. It depends on the issue. So I agree. It's not solely a partisan issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. Allison Kelzer, our roving reporter, do you, before we run out of time, are there some other questions you want to get in?
Yeah, and I think this applies to all of us in the conversation we're just having. What steps or actions can citizens take to support local ordinances that may conflict with current state laws and bring about change?
Some of you who are in politics want to speak to that?
Let's see, the candid answer is not a lot if our local ordinance, see the law professor, I just have to answer truthfully. If our local ordinance is in conflict with the state law, then our local ordinance, assuming that there's some comprehensive preemption, as you've noted, likely is unlawful. And we should catch that too and not look to enforce. But to get to the spirit of the question, what can we do? The elections just really matter, and everybody tells you to vote and that sort of thing, but they matter a lot. And frankly, something I've picked up on are a lot of our swing state senate districts, state representative districts that largely actually aren't in at least Kansas City, Missouri, south of the river. We have them in the Northland, certainly in the eastern Jackson County. I know throughout Johnson County they have a number of districts that are at least getting to that position. And I think, frankly, involvement and engagement in how you can change a legislature is key. And if you need an example, look no further than I've enjoyed watching Kansas actually over the last decade, where when Governor Brownback was able to have a more conservative state legislature, you saw a fascinating set of things occur, and then there was a bit of a retrenchment, and you saw some change in Kansas. You continue to see that, and so I think that's really where we can actually look to effectuate some policies, because I will say this, there is a time at which there is a limit as to what local government can do to fundamentally change the nature of how we address certain issues. Healthcare, gun reform, their housing policy fundamentally. We in Kansas City have been looking for a restoration of the low-income housing tax credit for several years now. Governor Greitens, for those who remember him, he was short-term, but an important one, I guess, was able to eliminate that program, and we've been looking to bring it back since. And so it's been my view that, frankly, we need to work to try to restore those sorts of things. So I think that's important. I'll make one other point, though. Lobbying and reaching out to people is actually more effective than you would think. If all of you today, before I left and got out the door, yelled at me about something, I'd remember it. If you all in unison shouted potholes, I'd be like, oh my gosh, there's a room of 200 people that said it again. I need to do something, even if I care about something drastically different. And so I do think, and Allison made this point before, and I'll note that I'm stealing it. Every year, if you actually just email and visit your state capital and say, we care about, let's say, gun violence, and you go to Topeka or Jefferson City, and hundreds of you say, we care, you have to notice us, over time, someone hears that. It may not change them, But bit by bit, it's how you actually make that change. And I think that's where we can be effective.
I'm going to largely repeat that, but in a slightly different way. I've worked with numerous cities and local jurisdictions around the country to enact gun safety laws, and a lot of times people come to me and say, I know that this other jurisdiction in my state has this law. We want it in our community. So I gave you a list of 3 or 4 things that I think Kansas City can do to continue its good work of reducing gun deaths. So there are organizations probably in Missouri, I'm sure in Kansas City. Moms Demand Action is a really great one that is mobilizing people for gun safety reform. So join one of those groups and say, I heard at an American Square event that there's this program in Kansas City that needs more funding. How can we get more funding? Let's form a coalition. Let's start writing letters. Or St. Louis has this ordinance, and I think I have seen it happen many, many times.
Sure. I wanted to just add, please don't overlook your local governments. Call and talk to your city council people, your county commissioners. Ask them, what are the issues that I need to be aware of that I can help promote with our state legislators? A lot of times people think only of talking and lobbying their state legislators, but we need your voice too. At the Johnson County Board of Commissioners, we have public comment session every single week, and I am always sad because often nobody's there, nobody says anything. So don't overlook those opportunities to build relationships with your local elected officials.
Potholes.
Allison Kelser, these questions have been great from the audience. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more quick ones.
Great, yes. I don't know if this one will be quick, so maybe just one. Can the panelists speak to ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and its impact and its model of legislation in encouraging states to pass preemptive legislation? So if you could speak about ALEC, explain what it is, and similar bodies of nature.
You had to end with that question, didn't you? Yeah. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is an organization that is funded by a number of private businesses, tend to be larger businesses, that is conservative in nature, more free market, promotes more libertarian hands-off legislation, which ironically in recent years, that libertarian principle behind ALEC has also advocated for greater amounts of preemption. I've been out of elected office for about 3 years. A lot of the preemption focus of ALEC has come during that time, so I can't speak to exact initiatives that ALEC is undertaking. But what I will tell you is, as a 10-year Republican legislator, 4 years in legislative leadership, I attended one ALEC conference. I was there for about a day and left after a day. And much like other organizations that are discussed of different ideological bents, I think the influence on individual lawmakers and policymakers of the suggestions that group makes have been greatly overstated. There are a number of pieces of legislation when I was in office that I was accused of carrying Alec's water on, and I was quite confused because my son's name is Alec, and he's now 11, and I couldn't figure out why my son cared so much about housing policy. But in all seriousness, it is easy to look at any of these sorts of organizations across the board and see just a straw man to attack that really isn't there. My experience, at least in Kansas, I can't speak for Missouri, is the vast majority of state legislators, whether we agreed with them or disagreed with them, they're not doing it for the money, because if they were doing it for the money in Kansas, they can't do math. They're not doing it out of any delusions of glory. They're not doing it to carry someone else's water from some, international or national organization. They're doing it because they think they're doing the right thing, and they may be and they may not be. But I strenuously want to hope that people here don't think that an organization like ALEC drives policy nearly the way that some fear.
Before we conclude, I just want to check in again with our fact checkers, Tom and Chris. Is there anything else we should know before we wrap up? Oh, need a microphone. Sorry, I should warn you, Allison, that I'm heading that way.
We've been talking about mainly gun control and preemption laws. I want to give you some statistics about the number of state and other policy issues. 45 states now have preemption laws concerning gun control. Among other policies, minimum wage, 24 states have preemption laws. Paid leave, 17 states. Anti-discrimination, only 3 states. Ride sharing, 37 states. Home sharing, 3 states. Municipal broadband, 17 states. And tax and expenditure limitations, 42 states. So just to give you an idea of how different policies, how important the states consider preemption laws.
Thank you. So American Public Square has a tradition of concluding with each panelist having a chance to make a final comment, and it's done in the form of answering 2 questions. So what and now what? So what? So what is important about what we've been talking about? And now what? I guess looking to the future. So we could start with Jeff.
So what? The loss of civility in the American political system is at the root of the preemption crisis that we're facing today. And now what? I hope everyone in this room does a small thing, even if it's finding a neighbor that disagrees with you politically and go out and have lunch with them. Because if we can do little things at the grassroots level to increase our understanding of others, I think that will trickle up rather than the bad stuff trickling down.
Janae?
In regard to so what, I hope that you'll all leave today having a better understanding of how preemptive laws impact your daily life and your community, that they are critical issues that tie the hands of local government to respond to what you want and need. So I hope you have a better understanding, and when you see issues in the paper or locally, you'll have a better sense of where that fits within this idea of preemption. Now what? I'm just going to repeat what I said before. Please know who your city council people are, know who your county commissioner is, get to know them, find out what the issues are at your local level and how you can get involved with that. Thank you.
So what? I'm going to echo what Jeff said a little bit about the politics of preemption, that it is used as a tool to achieve the political aims of different interest groups, and it has been used, and I would say that the influence of ALEC is greater perhaps than Jeff would in passing preemption laws, because they really have the 45 states. That's really a phenomenon that has taken place over the last 20, 25 years. And that the gun lobby and gun activists use preemption as a way to prevent gun laws, gun safety regulation. So the now what is, if you care about gun safety, if you care about preventing gun deaths in your state and your community, elect representatives who are going to prioritize your lives over gun industry profits or the rights of guns over people, and continue to push the limits of preemption by supporting novel policies.
Mayor Lucas?
So what? Much of our focus has been based on what is the state or what are states doing to cities. But part of the reason we've seen the trend on preemption is actually that cities have become more creative themselves. And so I think it is important for us to recognize that the American city is actually becoming, in some ways, a stronger unit and county in creating good policy solutions that affect us. That leads us to our now what. The next time you are reaching out to that county commissioner, that city council member, that mayor, recognize that your questions and answers needn't just be about issues we've always thought of as fundamentally local. your zoning, your water rates, something of that sort. But also increasingly, it does relate to gun violence, gun crime, healthcare, housing policy. It's our role, I think, particularly as we have gaps to fill and how we can create better opportunities in life for so many different folks in our communities, for local government to be a part of that answer. And I encourage all of you in each meeting to make sure that you're recognizing that at the local level.
As moderator, I'll take an opportunity to just throw in a few words of my own here right at the end. This discussion has been very interesting, and it reminds me of some things that I often tell my students. One of them being that controversial issues are controversial for a reason. It's because they don't have obvious, easy answers. This issue of what level of government is best to handle certain things has been around since the beginning of the United States. This is what the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were essentially debating about when they were deciding on the Constitution and all of that at the very beginning. And I think, again, there's no real one correct answer to it. An example I always give my students is you could think about the world of technology and the way different advancements are made. There have been great breakthroughs in some fields, like personal computers, for example, that were done by lone people working in their garage, you know, Apple computers or Hewlett-Packard or Microsoft or that sort of thing, where it was very small businesses and tinkering and making a breakthrough. And that works great for some things. There's other issues where that's just not going to work. You know, and the example I think of that is putting a person on the moon. People could experiment with rocketry and that sort of thing in their backyard for a long time, and without a combined national effort through something like NASA, you're just not going to put a person on the moon. So it really depends on the issue, and there's pros and cons to each side of it, so I'm sure it'll be something that continues to be debated for a long time. Well, I'd like to take the opportunity first to just thank all of our panelists. We're at the point where we can applaud again. And I'm going to turn the mic over now to Claire Bishop, who will wrap things up for us this evening.
Great. Can't help. It'll be like America's Got Talent. My name is Claire Bishop. Good evening. I'm the Executive Director at American Public Square at Jewel, and I'm going to close the evening with a couple of brief remarks. So first I want to echo what Alan just said and thank, Alan himself, our fantastic moderator for the evening, as well as our esteemed panelists, Jeff King, Commissioner Janae Hanslick, Allison Anderman, and Mayor Quentin Lucas. I'm going to get back over here because I've been told I move around too much and I'm supposed to be standing still up here. I'd also like to thank our fact checkers, Chris LeBeau and Tom Burns, our incredible roving reporter, Ms. Allison Kelzer, all the volunteers who helped us put this event on, including our planning committee for this event, which was led by Program Committee Chair Ward Katz. So thank you all very much. I'd also like to extend a very warm thank you to St. James Church for having us here. This has been a lovely venue for this program. We've really enjoyed being here. Dr. Emmanuel Cleaver, Yvette, and Tyrone, and all the team here have made us feel incredibly welcome, so thank you again for having us. American Public Square would like to present each of our panelists, along with our moderator, with an engraved civility bell, which you had at your station. So if you've got a bell in the audience, would you ring it loudly? Ding, ding, ding. You may find these, we didn't use them a lot, except for sort of in jest in tonight's program, but you may find that these come in very handy in your work, at home, and in the community. They can come in handy in all kinds of places. So thank you again. Thank you again also to tonight's program, event, season, and fact sheet sponsors. Your support makes our mission of improving the tone and quality of public discourse possible, and without it, we would not be able to do this work. So we're deeply appreciative of your support. I also want to voice my appreciation to the extended American Public Square team. We have got a phenomenal team, and that starts with Mr. Ambassador Alan Katz, Alana Mueller, Adam Erickson, Denisha Snell, Mary Espinoza, Allison Kelzer, of course, our extended team, which include Encore partners Robert Kurland and Terry Turner, as well as Springboard Creative. The work, again, would not be possible without this incredible team, and I want to give them a great thanks as well. If you had a fact check... Thank you. If you had a fact checker question that did not get addressed tonight, feel free to come see our fact checkers. They'll be lingering around for a few minutes after tonight's program, and you can engage with them directly. Tomorrow you will receive a post-event recap with some pictures, as well as an event survey, a post-event survey. We would really appreciate it if you take a few brief moments to fill that out. Your feedback is really important to us, and we use it to plan our future events. So we ask and encourage you to please, please, please fill that survey out. Please consider joining us for upcoming events as well. So on March 25th, we will do a program. It's the third in our Donnelly series. The subject of that program is the changing landscape of U.S. immigration law and policy, and that will be offered at the Central Library in partnership with RISE, which is an initiative of the Kansas City Public Library. Again, that's Wednesday, March 25th. And then on April 22nd, we will host an American Public Square student program focused on the environment in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So those are a few of our upcoming events, and we'll hope to be able to see you there. And finally, I'll just say this is a membership organization. As Alan mentioned, American Public Square is supported by many of you, our generous members in the audience. If you're not currently a member and you want to learn more about it, please come see us at the membership table. There are many options for membership, starting at $75 annually or $25 for a student membership. So please consider that on your way out the door. Thanks to every single one of you for being here, for opting into an important conversation in our community. It's great to see so many faces talking about these important issues, and we hope to see you at an event soon. Thank you.